afternoon to all the participants from India. Welcome to the special edition of our online lecture series organized jointly by the Department of English, Kharagpur College, and the Department of English, Agra SSB College. I am Jayanta Kumar Murmu, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English, Kharagpur College. I would like to thank our patrons Dr. Samanto, Principal, Kharagpur College, and Dr. Deepak Kumar Tamali, Principal, Agra SSB College, for supporting us to organize this lecture series. I would also like to thank my dear colleagues and the faculty members of the Department of English at Agra SSB College for extending their helping hands and make this series a success. I'd like to thank Professor Elizabeth Marino for giving her consent and to join our lecture series to make it international. Dear participants, this is my privilege to introduce our guest of honor to you. Professor Marino is tenured Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Rome Tor Vergata. In 2000, she published a book on Tamerlane in English and American literature and edited the proceedings of the 2001 Asia and the West Conference organized at Tor Vergata. She co-edited the collection of essays entitled Transnational, National and Personal Voices, New Perspectives on Asian American and Asian Diasporic Women Writers, 2004. And in 2005, she published a volume entitled An Introduction to British Bangladeshi Literature. She has translated poems by Mario Maggiotti Gilan, collected in a volume entitled Talismans or Talismani in 2006, and edited the second volume of an ebook, New Asian American Writers and News from UK, Italy, and Asia, Literatures and the Visual Arts in 2007. In 2010, she edited the second volume of another ebook, A City Between East and West, Istanbul, Shanghai. In the same year, she co-edited a volume entitled Positioning the New Chinese American Literature and the Changing Image of the American Literary Canon. In 2012, she edited, together with Tanfer Amin Tunk and Daniel Y. Kim, a special forum of Journal of Transnational American Studies dedicated to Shou Ling C. Wong, entitled Redefining the American in Asian American Studies, Transnationalism, Diaspora, and Representation. Her book on Mary Shelley and Italy was released in 2011. The volume she co-edited entitled Europe Facing Inter-Asian Cultural, Literary, Historical, and Political Situations was released in 2014, while another collection of essays she co-edited entitled The West in Asia and Asia in the West, Essays on Transnational Interactions has been released in 2015. In November 2016, she published a monograph devoted to romantic dramas on a mythological subject. She has published extensively on travel literature, on the English Romantic writers, on Italian American literature, Asian American, and Asian British literature. The topic on which she will deliver her lecture today is Ethnic Literatures in the US, the Worth of African American Literature and Italian American Literature. Thank you, ma'am. Good morning again. Uh, so let us begin this much awaited session. It's over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much indeed. And I would like, first of all, to thank you for inviting me and being here to share my thoughts with you. Now, in selecting the topic, I decided to focus on a very important topic that is extremely pivotal nowadays due to what happened, for example, to George Floyd. That is the problem of Black British and Black Americans and the problem of integration in the US. We all know that the United States were born as a melting pot, as the ideal of the melting pot. The ideal that, in a way, all the problems that Europe was facing would be sanitized, would be solved in the American context. This is the reason why many cities in the US feature the adjective new in front of a noun that was the noun of the British city, York, New York, Orleans, New Orleans, and the macro-state of New England as a regeneration of England. As we all know, the states faced a lot of problems. First of all, oh, can you hear me? Oh, yes. First of all, with the Native Americans, the new colonies were trying to overpower the natives, and living together was always very, very difficult. Now, why did I decide to put together African Americans and Italian Americans as two ethnic groups? Because they were considered to be very, very similar. Believe it or not, as I will try to tell you later on, Italians were not considered white. So they displayed the wrong shade of white. And among the stereotypes involving the Italian communities in the US, there were the stereotypes of being Negroes, Guineas, so not associated with the whites. And we all know that in America, the big myth was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But let's start with the African American community and the first leaders of the African American communities. One of the forerunners was Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass was a very prominent speaker, public speaker, who also participated in the cause of women's emancipation. In 1848, there was the so-called Seneca Falls Conference, which was a conference in which the rights of women and the rights of African American were both stated. And this is even before the Civil War and before the 13th Amendment that actually released the African Americans from slavery. But as I told you, Frederick Douglass was a forerunner. The two most important leaders that actually paved the ground for all other movements connected with the African American communities were Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Two important leaders who lived more or less in the same period, that is, in the second half of the 19th century, even though Booker T. Washington died in 1915, whereas Du Bois died only in 1963, so in relatively recent times. Those are the two leaders that, even though they were very different from one another in the way they perceived the African American communities, they actually were the first to state the fact that African Americans had rights and that Black lives mattered. So let's start with the first one. And if you have questions, we can leave them to the end. So Booker T. Washington was born as a slave, in actual fact, because he was born in 1856. And we all know that we had to wait until the end of the Civil War, so 65, to have the Blacks released. So he was born as a slave. And actually, being a slave, he didn't even know his exact date of birth. He didn't know his birthday, and he didn't have a surname. His name was just Booker. Then, when he was released together with the other ones, he started to build an identity as an individual. And he started also to mold his identity as a leader for other African Americans. First of all, he started to give himself a name. As I told you, he only had the first name, Booker. Then he added a T for Taliaferro, which is a middle name, because he noticed that everybody else had the middle name and he didn't. And then he chose for himself a surname. And as a surname, he chose Washington, the first president of the United States. And this is in itself a very important statement, because he wanted to clarify the fact that he perceived himself as American with all the rights to be American. Now, Booker T. Washington and Du Bois are connected in one aspect. They both considered education as a key to progress for the Black Americans. So they realized that unless Black Americans attained an education, they did not stand a chance to survive and be truly emancipated. So Booker decided to study, and actually he was self-taught at the beginning, but his mother decided to invest all her efforts and all her money to make her son a cultured man. So he studied and he graduated in one of those colleges that were created for Black Americans. And he decided to found himself a college, the so-called Tuskegee Institute. So he founded an institute, he founded a university. And this is another important statement. As we know, when the Pilgrim Fathers arrived in the American soil, in 1636, they founded the University of Harvard, because they realized that if they had a university, if they could educate the important class, the leading class, then they could rule the land. And so this is exactly what Booker T. Washington decided to do. He decided to create a university in which Black people could study and become important for society. Booker T. Washington was a man of the South, and we all know that the situation in the South of the United States was really critical, and it continued to be critical even after the end of the Civil War. There were lynching of Black people, and there were the Jim Crow laws, and the ideal was separate but equal. So in theory, Black people and white people were the same, they were equal, they had equal rights, but they had to keep separate. And this lasted for very, very long. That means that Black people had even different benches, different places where they could take water, different schools, different everything. They were separate. In theory equal, but they were separate. Now, the role of the university, of the institute that Booker T. Washington founded was very important, because he wanted to create a Black elite that was cultured and was educated in economics. Why economics? Because he believed that if African Americans were important for the economy of the United States, then they would have attained integration. And this is one of the most important points of divergence between him and the other leading figure that I will tell you about, that is Du Bois. Okay? So, economic side of the nation. He understood that if Black Americans were important for the economy of the country, then they would have been accepted. And he highlighted that in a very, very important speech that he delivered in Atlanta, Georgia, in front of an audience mostly made by white people. And this important speech was known as the Atlanta Address. Booker T. Washington's detractors, those that didn't like Washington, called the Atlanta Address the Atlanta Compromise because Booker T. Washington didn't go against the white. He wanted to maneuver things so that the white people would realize how important Black people were for the economy of the country. And I'm going to read a passage from the Atlanta Address that will clarify this and will make you understand. This is an important passage. Okay. As we have proven our loyalty, so he highlights the fact that Black Americans were loyal to the whites. As we have proven our loyalty to you in the past, in nursing your children, watching by the sickbed of your mothers and fathers, and often following them with tear-dimmed eyes to the graves, so in the future, in our humble way, we shall stand by you with the devotion that no foreigner can approach. And I will go back to this because this is important. Ready to lay down our lives, if need be, in defense of yours, interlacing our industrial, commercial, civil, and religious life with yours in a way that shall make the interests of both races one. In all the things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all the things essential to mutual progress. Now, the passage that I read is important for another aspect that was highly criticized by other ethnic groups. Now, when Booker T. Washington wrote the Atlanta Address in 1995, this is the period when other immigrants joined forces in the US. The Italians, tons of Italians arrived at the end of the 19th century. Then there were the Chinese, the Japanese, the Filipinos, there were a lot of other ethnic groups, the Irish. So, in this way, by stating exactly what is stated, Booker T. Washington is saying, don't trust the others, trust the Black Americans. The Black Americans and the white can rule together. We can be separate, but we are one hand when it comes to mutual progress. And acting in this way, Booker T. Washington was actually the first Black American to enter the White House. In 1901, he was invited for dinner by the President Teddy Roosevelt. And this was a very important moment for African Americans because up until that moment, African Americans were considered objects. They were considered things. And now I'm sort of quoting the working title, the working subtitle of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin had a working subtitle that is The Man That Was a Thing, because African Americans were actually considered as objects. Now, Booker T. Washington also wrote an autobiography. And this is another statement. Why? Because the autobiographical genre is the American genre par excellence. Think, for example, of all the autobiographies of the first Puritans, of William Bradford, of John Winthrop. So he is making a lot of statements that he is American. But he is doing it starting from the bottom. And I am quoting now the title of his autobiography. The title of his autobiography, published in 1901, is Up from Slavery. which somehow highlights the fact that African Americans cannot go directly to the top. They have to go slowly, gradually up from slavery. And this is the most important point of divergence between him and Du Bois. But let me tell you a little bit more about Du Bois first. While Booker T. Washington was a man of the South, Du Bois was a man of the North, and we know what that means. Booker T. Washington was born a slave. Du Bois was born a free man because he was born in 1868. And that made all the difference. Being from the North, being free, a free man from the beginning. And actually, in his biographical writings, he highlights the fact that he never perceived himself as different from the others. Actually, never at all. The only time as a child that he realized that he was somehow different from the others was when a little girl from the South refused to play with him because he was black. But up until that moment, he never saw himself as different from the others. Now, Du Bois' mother had her own land. She was not well off, but she could live reasonably well. So she could afford a good education for her son. So Du Bois was a very bright, very intelligent boy, and with the effort of his mother and of the whole community, he could go to university. He went to Fisk College. That was a college for Black people. But Du Bois didn't want to be labeled as Black. He really dreamed of a real integration between blacks and whites, even though we are living in the period of the Jim Crow laws. So he wanted to go to the most important university of the United States, that is Harvard. But Harvard refused to acknowledge his degree. And he didn't get himself discouraged. He started over again. He was admitted to Harvard. And he graduated with honors, which is something unheard of because virtually nobody graduated with honors at Harvard. Leave it aside the fact that it was a black man that was graduating, which was unheard of. So, differently from Booker T. Washington, he wanted to expand his horizons. So after graduating from Harvard, he decided to travel. He went to Europe and he worked and studied in Berlin. Then he went back again to the USA and he furthered his education with a PhD from Harvard. And he studied sociology. And this is another point of divergence between Booker T. Washington and Du Bois. The first one, as I told you, studied economics. The second one was more into liberal arts, more into the humanities. And he was convinced that African Americans could study whatever they wanted. They did not have to limit themselves to one topic only. They could study philosophy, they could study mathematics, they could study literature, sociology, law, whatever they wanted. Whereas Booker T. Washington started with a humbler pace, up from slavery. Now, Du Bois, who was at the beginning a good friend of Booker T. Washington, after the Atlanta address, decided to separate from him and to start his own career. And as a sociology, he carried out an important sociological study in Philadelphia. Why Philadelphia? Because Philadelphia was a city where a lot Black Americans lived, and where there were a lot of frictions, a lot of ethnic tensions, and he wanted to investigate that. And he devoted a lot of months to write a book that was called The Philadelphia Negro, which he published in 1899. Now, what did he find out in his sociological research? First of all, he found out that he himself, even though he was Black, he was not regarded as truly Black by the Black Americans of Philadelphia. Why? Because he was educated. He was different from them. And therefore, he realized that all the criminal activities, all the frictions, all the ethnic tensions stemmed from the lack of education of Black Americans. He also realized another thing. Black Americans did not trust white Americans as teachers. So he invented what he called the talented tenth. So 1 out of 10 Black Americans should have a higher education, and this Black American should be somehow a bridge between all the Black Americans and the whites. So this talented tenth should carry the Black Americans towards education and emancipation. So this was his most important findings after his sociological research. Then he also participated in many conferences, in the Pan-African Conference in 1900 in London, and he delivered a brilliant speech in which he criticized colonialism as the root of all evil. So colonialism for him was the basis, the ground of every problem that not just the United States of America were facing, but all the world. So remove colonialism and then you will see that the world will change. Then he also wrote an autobiography like Booker T. Washington for similar reasons. And his autobiography was called The Souls of Black Folks. And this autobiography was articulated in 14 different chapters that actually were 14 different essays. The interesting thing is that every chapter opened with a quotation. The quotation could be a quotation from the highest literature of Europe. I don't know, for example, from French writers, of English writers, or a quotation from a Black spiritual. That is to say, the highest literature and the literature, the oral literature of Black Americans is the same level, the same worth, the same dignity. So this is important. The same. Equality, equal rights. And in this autobiography, he highlighted many problems. And he highlighted the fact that African Americans were somehow shrouded in a veil, and this veil prevented the others from understanding Black Americans and Black Americans from understanding the others. So the veil, that is the veil of stereotypes and prejudices, had to be removed. In this work, he also highlighted the importance of a dual allegiance of Black Americans. So for him, Black Americans were Black, so they were African, and they had to cherish their roots because their roots were very important, but they also had to cherish their being American. They were American. They didn't need to become American because they already were American. So Black Americans had like a dual citizenship, African and American. Now, and he also highlighted the fact that African Americans, in truth, were the real Americans because they had to fight for liberty, and they had to emancipate themselves. They had to strive to attain those inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that were stated in the Declaration of Independence. So the real American was for him the Black American. Now, like Du Bois, as I told you, he understood that education was the key, the solution to the problem. And I quote a very short passage from of our spiritual strivings, which is the most autobiographical among the essays included in the Souls of Black Folks. And I quote, "The training of the schools we need today more than ever. The training of deft hands, quick ears, and above all, a broader, deeper, higher culture of gifted minds and pure hearts." So this is important, education. Now, let's move now to the Italian Americans. As I told you, the Italian Americans, when they arrived in the United States, and they arrived, the first Italian Americans actually arrived, I think, in the 18th century, but mass migration was at the end of the 19th century and the first 2-3 decades of the following century. But when they arrived, Italian Americans did not want to remain in the States. They just wanted to make a fortune. It was the land of promise, the land of opportunity. So they wanted to make money and go back and share their fortunes with the family. So they were called the birds of passage because like birds, like migratory birds, they would go and they would come back to their homelands. Obviously, most of them did not come back, but they settled in ethnic enclaves. And at first, they did not bother to mix with the other Americans because they didn't want to stay. So they created some ethnic enclaves that somehow reproduced the environment that they knew back home. The Little Italis. And in Little Italis, the official language was Italian, or better, the regional Italian that was spoken back in their homeland. And I mean, they were self-protective environments where they could meet their friends, they could be with their own people. But with the passing of time, when people decided not to come back because sometimes they didn't have the money to go back to Italy, Little Italis were transformed into ethnic ghettos. And even the English language transformed to include, even though in a derogatory way, the Italian Americans. And I will explain to you. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, there were some stereotypes or some bad expressions, derogatory expressions to indicate the Italians. So the English language, the American language, created new words to indicate the Italians. WAP was one of them. WAP means without passport or without papers, because most of the times the Italians had no legal papers. Or Guinea, because they were considered like Africans. They were black. I mean, the Italians from the south are much darker. Also because they stayed a lot in the sun. They were farmers. They worked the land, and therefore they got a suntan, and they were considered to be black. Or let me think of another stereotype. Greaseball, because the Italians used to wear some grease in the hair to make it shiny, because they considered it fashionable, and but they were looked upon as slimy people, as horrible people by the Americans, even though they worked a lot, but probably because they worked so much and they accepted very, very, very low wages. So somehow they stole the job of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, because the whites did not accept the sort of low salaries that were accepted by the Italians. Italian American literature was born much later if compared also to the African American literature. One of the first writers was Pietro di Donato. I will tell you why the development was delayed. Because they simply worked, and they did not integrate. They wanted to go back, so they worked, and that's it. And also for another reason, the second generation of Italian Americans were encouraged, the second and third generation were encouraged by their relatives not to study Italian, not to learn Italian, because they had to integrate. So if they had to integrate, they couldn't display the symptoms, let's call them in this way, of Italianness. Okay, they had to throw themselves into the American melting pot. So we have some kind of cultural amnesia of the Italian American community. And Pietro di Donato, who himself was a worker, was a brick worker, is one of the first Italian American writers who wrote a beautiful that I strongly recommend you to read if you get the chance. That is called Christ in Concrete, or Christ in Concrete. In a way, the Italians were viewed as Jesus Christ. They sacrificed themselves. But the only difference between the Italian Americans and Jesus Christ was the fact that Christ resurrected, and he sacrificed himself for a reason, whereas the Italian Americans were just, they sacrificed themselves for nothing. So this is a very pessimistic novel, stemming from the experience of his father, who died actually on Good Friday in 1923, and he died, and concrete fell on top of him and he died. So he was viewed as a kind of Christ who was denied the possibility to resurrect. Now, from this very first writer, we have to wait a lot before having some kind of ethnic pride on the part of the Italians. And this ethnic pride became major in the 80s. The 80s, the 1980s, was a decade that was extremely important for African Americans, for Chinese Americans, for all the ethnic groups, because they started to develop and to claim rights, to develop a literature of their own. And most poets and writers of the Italian American community described this very process from the denial of their cultural roots to the proud affirmation of their ethnicity. And I'm just going to give you a couple of instances from one of the most important Italian American contemporary poets, That is Maria Mazziotti Gillen, that I translated into Italian. She herself did not and does not speak Italian. She speaks a regional dialect of Italian, but not Italian, because as I told you, there was this kind of amnesia of the ethnic roots. And I'm going to read you a couple of poems that somehow summarize the whole process that the Italian American community had to go through, from the denial of one's roots to the proud assertion of them. The first poem I'm going to read is entitled Betrayals. And the title in itself is meaningful because she betrayed her own origin. I'm going to read it for you. At 13, I screamed, "You are disgusting," drinking your coffee from a saucer. Your startled eyes darkened with shame. You, one dead leg dragging, counting night shift hours. You, smiling past yellowed, gaping teeth. You, mixing the eggnog for me yourself in a fat dime store cup. How I betrayed you. This you is her father. Over and over, ashamed of your broken tongue. How I laughed, savage and innocent, at your mutilations. Today, my son shouts, "Don't tell anyone you're my mother," hunching down in the car so the other boys won't see us together. Daddy, are you laughing? Oh, how things turn full circle. My own words coming back to slap my face. I was 16 when you called one night from your work. I called you dear, loving you in that moment past all the barriers of the heart. You called again every night for a week. I never said it again. I wish I could say it now. Dear, my dear, with your twisted tongue, I did not understand you dragging your burden of love. So she is describing her relationship with her father. She denied her father. Now she would like to recover her relationship with him, but it's too late because he's dead. And this is exactly what is happening with her son. Her son looks at her as too Italian, and therefore he is ashamed of her, like she was ashamed of her father. So again, the last poem I'm going to read is a poem in which she comes to terms with herself and with their Italian Americanessa. And if you want, at the end of this lecture, I will send you a file. I will share some poems with you because they are extremely beautiful and insightful. And this poem is entitled Learning How to Love Myself, which is important if you have a split identity, but is important for everybody, everybody. Now, she describes herself. My hair is dark black and electric because she's really curly. Left it to itself, it would spring off my head in ringlets. I could never control it, nor when I was growing up. It stuck out from my head like a kinky tent. My legs are stumpy and thick, the knees swollen, the veins protruding. My small feet are wide, and my body is planted on the ground like a fat shrub. When I sit on a high stool in the TV station, I see my short, sturdy legs, my thick body that carries me along, unstoppable, into my life. This peasant body. For years, I longed for the grace of a long body, tall and supple as marsh grass. but would not give up this incredible energy, the heat that pours from the furnace of my body. The long line of women who taught me to laugh my deep belly laugh and grab the world in my arms and squeeze the sweetness out. So, in a way, learning to accept oneself is accepting one past, one mother's, and one's identity, and loving it and embracing it and being proud of it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. This is an
I don't know
engaging
whether
from Kharagpur College. This is really an talk, ma'am. Now,
I can't hear you very well. Now you
am I
are,
audible,
yes.
ma'am? Hello? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, now you are, yes.
Ma'am, this is really an engaging and informative talk. And now I request the two scholars who joined here to clear their doubts and queries, if any. You may ask your questions either directly by switching your microphone on chat box.
I would like to just put my observation. Hello.
Yes, please. Hello, yes, I can hear you.
Hello. Welcome to India, ma'am. So first of all, because it is really nice and insightful lecture that I have heard from you. Earlier also, I heard you in the Gnosis lecture series, and you talked on Mary Shelley. That was really wonderful. Again, I'm really enlightened to find you here, the cheerful face and the lecture. So really very wonderful. And I would like that I should get you in touch with you on email or etc. because really it's lovely lectures that you deliver. I'm really impressed and I'm falling in love with you. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted. I'm delighted.
Okay, I'm Dr. Seema Sarkar and from Uttar Pradesh, Lucknow.
Oh, from Lucknow. I was in Lucknow twice. I love Lucknow. It's beautiful. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for loving the place. And really, I pray that everybody should stay safe and happy in this crisis period. Thank you so much, ma'am. Yes. Really, love the lecture. Very insightful. Thank you.
Ma'am,
and thanks to organizers.
Ma'am, there is a question in the chat box. The question is from Saurabh Patra.
Okay.
The question is, what is your comment on anti-Tom literature?
Okay, what does exactly this colleague mean by anti-Tom literature? If she can please clarify, and I will address it.
Saurabh Patra?
If is it possible, Saurabh Patra, if is it possible to write your comment, to expand a little bit more? Oh yes, there he is, yes.
Yes, ma'am. I want you about your information the anti-Tom literature, what you about it.
I can't hear you. But
hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are now.
Ma'am, I want to know from you.
Yes,
that the perspective they want to refer in anti-Tom literature. What is your comment about it as a whole?
Okay. Right.
Literature?
Okay. So basically, you want to know something about the literature that was pro-slavery. Hello?
Yeah.
Oh my God! Can you hear me? Oh, because I can't. Okay, now yes. Right. In a way, the person that was considered as the one who broke this kind of literature was Harriet Beecher Stowe, as you know. Okay, but in actual fact, Harriet Beecher Stowe was full of stereotypes because Uncle Tom's Cabin, as you all know, is a novel in which Tom, to be accepted, has to resemble white people because he's Christian, he sacrifices himself, and he has to identify himself with acceptable models because otherwise he would not be accepted. The one who really broke with the previous tradition and created a new image of the African American literature was in actual fact Mark Twain with the character of Jim in Huckleberry Finn. Because, as you know, Jim acts as a father for Huckleberry, and he's the most ethical character in the novel. So I would regard Mark Twain as the most important writer who broke with the stereotypes of the African American. And of course, in poetry, Walt Whitman was the one who really celebrated the man, no matter what was the color of his or her skin. Okay, I hope I answered your question.
Hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are, Irana.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the wonderful lecture. You just made us absolutely spellbound. Thank you so much. Ma'am,
Thank you.
as we see this African American literature, it dealt with a lot of fascism, the
Yes.
forcible suppression of the opposition power that emerged in Italy and Germany as well by Mussolini and Hitler, as we all know the leaders, ma'am. So, ma'am, I have a confusion that how much impact of fascism we see in this Afro-American literature. Can you please explain, ma'am?
Okay, I would not speak about fascism in African American literature, but certainly, the idea of supremacy was lurking, especially in the south of the United States. We all know that these are the years of KKK, Ku Klux Klan. These are the years
Yes.
of the lynching, not just of Black Americans, because in actual fact, the most horrible and the biggest lynching that was ever performed in the USA, in New Orleans, was actually a lynching of Italian Americans. So this idea of white supremacy was really tragic in those days. I would not connected with fascism nor with Nazism, but with the more general ideal of white supremacy, which is still a problem nowadays in the States, but not just in the States, because you all know that in many states of Europe, for example, there are unfortunately a lot of movements now stating the supremacy of the whites, and even in Italy, unfortunately, there are some parties or some, groups with leaders who somehow glorify that moment of the
Hello?
Italian history.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Secondly, ma'am, I have another observation,
Sure.
ma'am. If you permit, then I can
Yes.
continue.
Yes.
As we see in Harlem Renaissance, for example, the color purple, their eyes were watching God. Even in the famous film *The Django Unchained*, the famous actor Leonardo DiCaprio, we see they borrow from non-written oral traditions and folk life of African diaspora. So, can we say that it broke the mystic of connection between the literary authority and patriarchal power? If you can
Yes,
explain, ma'am.
I would say so. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Yes, it certainly did. Certainly did. Thank you for the comment. Very insightful.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, there is another question from Amrita Pritam.
Where is it in
Uh,
the? Okay, sorry. Okay.
uh,
I want to know that are the Italian writers and the writings equally treated in the mainstream literature in the US, especially in recent days? This is a very interesting question. In actual fact, no, because in actual fact, if you think of even of recent, well, not recent because you are very young, but I am not. But if you think, for example, of the film The Untouchables, Brian De Palma, blockbuster, all the films connected with mafia, because it is true, the Italians brought the mafia to the US, but the Italians were not just the mafia. So still, the Italians are regarded mostly in their connection with the criminal activities of Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, of the 1920s. So still, there are a lot of stereotypes on the Italians, like there are a lot of stereotypes on the blacks, as we saw it even in recent happenings. So unfortunately, it's very difficult to create this harmony between the different parts composing the United States, and especially now that we have this even health crisis, the frictions and the differences and the problems are becoming more and more dramatic and tragic. So in actual fact, nowadays the situation is as critical as it was in the past. Of course, we have no massive lynchings, but still we have a lot of tensions and a lot of injustice nowadays. Yes. Now I'm reading also the other questions. What is your take on Indo-American literature, the Indian diaspora? Okay, yes, the Indian diaspora I've been dealing with, but especially in the British side and also in the Danish side, because one of the most important and most admired by me writers is Tabish Kher, that I'm sure you all know. I focus, for example, in my work on the Indian partition, and I noticed that the Indian partition is still a very, very sore point in the collective imagination of writers. So even nowadays, there are many novels, many short stories collections that revolve around the idea of the Indian partition, because it is more or less the same thing that we have seen today. So the idea of religious or ethnic difference that creates or is led to create problems. So yes, yeah. I'm reading other questions now. How does the Black Arts era differ in philosophical scope from the Harlem Renaissance? Okay, the Harlem Renaissance actually was triggered by what I told you about. So the Harlem Renaissance, and also later the movement of the Black Panthers and the big emancipation movements, all stemmed from the two writers that I told you about, from Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois. So those were the engines, and the engines started and they created all the rest. If we had not had those two philosophers, writers, thinkers, probably the development of any other movement connected with the Black Americans would have been much different.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for my question. It was wonderful listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Do you have a question?
Ma'am, you just addressed my question.
Sorry. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
thank you. There is a question by Sandy Pansau, do you think in the USA government institution have also prejudices that the black people are born criminal? Hey, if there is a crime happen, it must be done by a black people. Okay, now this is a stereotype that dates back to the beginning of the 20th century. Yes, this is connected with the KKK movement, with the white supremacist movement. Even Italian Americans were considered inherently inferior. There were a lot of treatises, scientific or pseudo-scientific treatises that testified the fact that Italian people were prone to violence. For example, one of the, as I told you, one of the nicknames for the Italians was Dago, and Dago comes from dagger, because the Italians were immediately ready to use weapons to solve any problem. And the blacks as well were considered inferior. Okay, yes, there were a lot of pseudo-scientific ideas in that respect. And I am afraid, I believe that some people
Ma'am, we can't hear you. Hello, ma'am.
of black literature. Yes, yes. I am reading the last question.
Yes, ma'am.
If you have a question, no, if you have a question, then I can address that.
Janta, is there any question from YouTube?
No, Chinmada, there is no question from YouTube.
Ma'am, there is one more question in the chat box from Snigdha Sri
Yes.
Senapati. Can you take the question, ma'am?
Yes. Yes, okay. Yes, she connects, or he, I'm sorry, I'm very ignorant. This colleague connects Greek and Roman literature. Okay. Now, not really Greek, but Roman literature was also a Latin literature. The Latin culture had the in itself the myth of power. Okay, and if you think, for example, also of fascism in Italy, fascism exploited very much the imagery of Latin culture, of the Roman Empire, okay? But in a way, they misunderstood it. And the philosophy behind the Roman and also the Greek Empire, think of Alexander Magnus, he was misunderstood because they wanted to create harmony between the people. It is true they conquered peoples, but they respected the culture of those countries. They allowed them to express themselves. And especially Alexander Magnus, for example, he fostered intermarriage so that people could blend in. Whereas in America, this idea of blending through marriage from the very first days was regarded as a threat for the nation. It was the so-called danger and fear of miscegenation. Okay, so people felt they could be contaminated by people belonging to other ethnic groups in case they mixed. And there were laws in the states that prevented this mixing of races. Think, for example, of the Chinese community. The Chinese community, with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1888, if I'm not mistaken, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented Chinese people from also from marrying, from dating white Americans, and they could not have their wives with them, and therefore a bachelor society was born, so that they could be isolated, they could not mix with the rest of society, and as soon as they finished their job, which was the construction of the railroad, they would be sent back to the mother country. So, I mean, it was a misunderstanding of the Roman idea of creating harmony between the various people that were conquered.
Thank you. It was really a good experience hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. You are really an impressive speaker, ma'am. And this is really an interactive session. Now let us move towards the Thanksgiving session. I request Pothik Pradhan of Egra SSB College to deliver vote of thanks. Pothik, over to you.
A very good morning, ma'am.
Good morning.
Welcome to India. Welcome to India, though through this digital platform. Ma'am, we all are grateful to you because you have graced us with your kind consent to be here among us to exchange your valuable thoughts with us and to enlighten us. It was indeed an amazing session. It was enchanting, energetic, and engaging at the same time, ma'am. Obviously, we have to mention the recitation by you. It was like icing on the cake, a bonus for all of us. And ma'am, obviously, I think that all of us have become very fond of you after listening to you, after seeing your this mesmerizing smile, ma'am. There is something very much special in your smile. Thank you very much, ma'am, with us.
Thank you so much.
Pray for your good health during this crisis-ridden situation, ma'am. Stay safe.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Thank you, ma'am. And at the same time,
ma'am.
Yes.
I hope we will get your kind consent again whenever we try to organize such online or offline lecture series.
Yes, of course, of course. I'm leaving you my email address in the chat box,
yes.
So that if any of you want to get in touch, I will be more than delighted.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Over to you, Pothik.
Yes. Of course, as one of our colleagues had mentioned, we would like to have you as our resource person in many other such programs that you organize in future, and hope that you will grace us once again with your kind consent.
Yeah, of course.
Now, I would like to thank all the organizers, the principals of both the colleges, for making this happen, because it is because of them that we are right now listening to this wonderful speech on this platform, and that too in an international level, of course. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants who have patiently listened to ma'am's speech and who have made the interactive session so much engaging. Thank you very much. And with this, I think we should end today's session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So, bye-bye.
Bye, ma'am. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.